June 6th, 2019 is the 75th anniversary of D-Day, our final salute to more than 70,000 Americans who landed in Normandy to fight to end World War II.
As an Army veteran, I know what kind of teamwork it takes to serve. 75 years later, we know how brave you are, and your hometown station salutes you.
It was an honor to serve in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, just knowing that I followed in the footsteps of some great men who made their first combat jumps on D-Day. Your hometown station thanks you for your service.
As a Marine, I understand loyalty and honor. And as we gather here in Bedford on this 75th anniversary of D-Day, I just want to say, Semper Fi.
Your hometown station is commemorating the brave troops who fought and died that day.
We're here at the National D-Day Memorial with special live coverage.
We're remembering the bravery and sacrifice as your hometown station honors the heroes of D-Day.
And good morning to you from the National D-Day Memorial. I'm Robin Reed.
And I'm Jean Jadham. Thanks for joining us for this special live coverage final salute. You know, it was 75 years ago today that the Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. No town in America suffered as much loss of life as the small town of Bedford. 21 men never made it home.
And Jean, today's program includes some amazing things, presentation of the colors, the color guard, but the most amazing thing is the aerial display we're about to see as 12 different aircraft from World War II will fly overhead. We're going to turn it over to Rob Ryder, the air boss in control of the air show, to kick off the program today.
To Mr. Vice President, veterans, families, honored guests, and all who share an interest in the history of our nation. Welcome to the National D-Day Memorial and to the 75th anniversary commemoration of the D-Day invasion. In all, there were 11 Allied nations involved in this attack, including 11,600 aircraft, 7,000 naval vessels, more than 156,000 troops, and of those troops, 37 young men from this community known as the Bedford Boys took part, and 20 of them perished. We're here to honor those who fought and survived, mourn the loss of those who died, and to recognize their valor and bravery and sacrifice of all of them and their families. We are citizens of a nation grateful for their service. Even as we focus on this Operation Overlord, there were several themes common to all who helped earn the Allied victory in World War II. First, everyone participated, if not in uniform, then working in the factories, building the machines, producing the munitions and supplies that our boys put to such effective use on dozens of different battlefields around the world. Second, there is a genuine, heartfelt humility among those men who willingly walked into harm's way to protect and defend this country. As recently as yesterday evening, I heard a personal hero of mine tell a small group of people that he was just doing his job. Finally, and most poignantly, the deep respect that the veterans here with us today have for those who they consider to be the real heroes of World War II, those men who didn't come home, the warriors who gave their last full measure of devotion to the epic struggle that took place 7 decades ago in faraway places like Burma, Bataan, Bastogne, Cassino, the Coral Sea, Tinian, Tunisia, and of course, Normandy. Today, we have the opportunity to bring history to life here in Bedford as we see some of the aircraft that were part of World War II and the greatest generation. Approaching from the south in just a moment, we are actually going to see first a German fighter. Because by the middle of 1940, nearly a year and a half before the U.S. entered the war, the Germans had overtaken nearly all of Western Europe, and they had their sights set on conquering England. The aircraft flying over right now is the Focke-Wulf FW-190. It was one of the planes sent to destroy Britain's Royal Air Force. The plane was fast, very fast, and with later versions having a top speed of about 425 miles per hour. There were 29,000 of these aircraft built. The 190, along with the Messerschmitt Bf-109, engaged the Royal Air Force Hurricanes and Spitfires in the skies over England in what was to be known as the Battle of Britain. From July Until the end of October 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, used the WWII and other planes to soften up the UK for a full-scale invasion. Let's listen to the sound of the WWII. But the Royal Air Force, despite heavy losses, was able to repel the round-the-clock attacks on England. One of the RAF fighters that helped fend off the Luftwaffe is coming up next. Of Germany's leading aces, a gentleman by the name of Otto Cattell scored most of his reported 267 kills in the WWII, inflicting cruel punishment on the slow and vulnerable bomber formations that were almost impossible to defeat until long-range fighters became available to escort the bombers to and from their targets. The Battle of Britain, July 10th through October 31st, 1940. By the time the Battle of Britain reached its peak, the RAF had nearly 1,400 Supermarine Spitfires. It was one of the most capable Allied fighters in the war and had excellent high-altitude fighting capabilities. The Spits were fairly evenly matched with the Messerschmitt Bf-109s, but some consider it the early models to be inferior to the FW-190. However, the tactics and skill of the Royal Air Force pilots, along with the tremendous production capacity of the RAF to build planes, helped give them the edge, eventually pushing back the Germans and bringing to an end the Battle of Britain on October 31st and ending Hitler's plans to invade England. One Royal Air Force Spitfire pilot, Flight Lieutenant David Crook, became an ace with 5 aerial victories during the Battle of Britain. He was given the Distinguished Flying Cross on October 1st. He then became a flight instructor, but sadly, in December of 1944, he disappeared while on a photographic mission. The Spitfire was powered by a Rolls-Royce liquid-cooled V12 Merlin engine that gave it a top speed of over 350 miles per hour. That engine was to play an important part in the development of one of the United States Army Air Force's finest fighters. If you will look now, we can hear and see the Spitfire approaching. In memorializing the effort of the Royal Air Force during those desperate days in the summer of 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill paid tribute to the pilots of the Battle of Britain. Listen to his words.
To the British airmen who, undaunted by odds, unwearied in their constant challenge and mortal danger, are turning the tide of the world war by their prowess and by their devotion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Now let's talk about training pilots. There were 3 phases of training in the United States military: primary, basic, and advanced. With cadets flying the simplest to the most complex trainers that would, if they didn't wash out or die, in the fighters. They would move into the fighters and the bombers and the cargo aircraft in combat. Each phase was initially about 12 weeks long, with 65 to 75 hours of flying. As the need for pilots increased during the war, each phase was shortened to 10 weeks and then to 9 weeks. Training was a dangerous game. Of the approximately 120,000 airmen who died in the war, 15,000 were killed in training accidents here in the U.S. alone. Among the trainers used was the Boeing Stearman, a 1920s design with a late 1920s power plant. It was the most widely used primary trainer in the World War II. It was known as the Stearman. The Royal Canadian Air Force called it the Cadet. It was also nicknamed Yellow Peril. So simple was this 225 horsepower, 100 mile per hour biplane that it had no radio. The only way for the instructor to communicate with the cadet was to use a Gosport, kind of like a stethoscope, with a funnel at one end into which the instructor would shout instructions, hooked up to a rubber hose that connected into the ear cups of the cadet's helmet. The student could not talk back. The exact number of Stearmans that remain is unknown, but estimates were that approximately 10,000 were built, with many thousand more in the form of spare parts. With a Continental or a Lycoming or a Jacob engine, these airplanes were saved from the scrap heap because after World War II, they became used as agricultural spray aircraft, putting more powerful engines on them, upping the horsepower from 225 horsepower all the way up to 450 horsepower with a Pratt & Whitney R985. And then, after that, it has now become a staple of air shows around the country, taking it back to the days of the Barnstormer. After World War I, when the average life of a fighter pilot was only about 3 weeks, aviators who survived the war would then buy a surplus World War I Curtiss Jenny trainer and fly over a town and do aerial stunts and then land in a farmer's field and then give rides for $5 or $10 a piece. That was one of the stories of how barnstorming came to be. But what we will see approaching here in just a moment are 4 of these Stearman biplanes, known as the N2S by the United States Navy, the PT-17, Primary Trainer 17, by the United States Army Air Force, the Cadet by the Royal Canadian Air Force. It is open cockpit flying. They are biplanes in which the cadets learned the basics of flight. It was a 1,000-pound or so airplane that was docile and easy to fly, but due to the landing gear being so close together, was sometimes dangerous on the ground, and oftentimes the cadets were victims of the dreaded ground loop. In the diamond formation, approaching now the Stearman flight. The formation flying we are seeing done now is done without radio communication. The lead pilot selects the right altitude, attitude, and airspeed, and each of the wingmen doesn't know where the ground ends and the sky begins. He is focused on several points on the lead aircraft and maintains his position with respect to that lead aircraft. It's this kind of formation flying that was taught during the primary phase of training. The next aircraft approaching is an example of a type of fighter that didn't work out so well for the United States, or any other country for that matter. It's the North American P-64. It might be said that the P-64 was the fighter version of the AT-6, the advanced trainer, the Texan. We'll see those aircraft shortly. But the P-64 was to be manufactured and exported to other countries. 7 went to Peru, where they nicknamed it Torito for Little Bull. And 6 more were to be sold to the Royal Thai Air Force, but were seized prior to their shipment because of Thailand's growing ties to Japan. They were actually used here in the United States as fighter trainers. That's a total of 13 airplanes, and that's all that were built. Contrast that to the number of basic trainer, the Vultee Vibrator, or the Vultee Valiant, it is as it was officially called, some 10,000, or the P-47 Thunderbolts, approximately 15,000. It's easy to see that this was not a successful aircraft. It was obsolete, actually, by the time the U.S. entered the war. Following the primary phase of training was the basic training phase. Again, about 12 weeks of flying and 75 hours of airtime for the cadet. They were in more complex airplanes like the Vultee Valiant that I mentioned a moment ago. It had a 450 horsepower motor on it and had radio communications gear and increased the workload on the cadet. And if he could master that, he would then move on to the final phase of training, and that's advanced training. Approaching a few miles out are 4 North American Texan aircraft manufactured in Texas. They will also be in what is known as a diamond formation. Officially, the Army Air Force called it the AT-6, Advanced Trainer 6. The Navy designated it the SNJ, S for Scout, N for Navy, and J for the designation of North American Aviation, the manufacturer. And the Royal Air Force dubbed it the Harvard. It was indeed an institution of higher learning. It was universally known as, though, the pilot maker. This 5,500-pound trainer was the last plane a cadet would fly before earning his wings. From the Texan, he'd move on to fighters, bombers, or transport airplanes. Depending on whose history book you read, the number of Texans ranged from 10,000 to 15,000, and a couple of sources as many as 22,000 that were built. Even North American Aviation's historian says the exact number will never be known. A significant number were built under license in Canada, Some in Australia, a modification known as the Whirlaway, but in all, nearly 30 Allied nations flew this type of aircraft. It was a rugged machine that found its way into the Korean War in 1950 to 1953, flying low and slow over the battlefield, searching for targets of opportunity or attracting ground fire, then marking the targets with white phosphorus rockets for the fast-moving jets to hit. They were known as mosquito missions. This is a 600-horsepower radial piston engine. It cruised along at about 150 miles per hour, and the growl you were hearing is actually the sound of the propeller tips going supersonic at about 2,250 revolutions per minute. The North American Texan. Back in the day, the AT-6 cost the American government about $23,000. Next, we have the Piper L-4, part of the group of airplanes known as Army Cooperation Aircraft. They were adapted from or later used as general aviation aircraft. Their roles were observation, transporting commanders, and delivering messages. And it was this particular mission that earned this particular type of airplane the nickname Grasshopper. The Army Liaison's plane's famous name is said to have come about in the summer of 1942 when Piper pilot Henry Wan was directed to fly a message from Fort Bliss, Texas, to the Cavalry Major General Innes Swift at his field headquarters. The general saw Wan's rough landing in a field and then commented, "You looked like a damn grasshopper when you landed in those boondocks and bounced around." Later, when Swift wanted Wan and his little plane to return, he sent a message to Fort Bliss, quote, "Send Grasshopper." Bliss's personnel were baffled until Wan told them the story, and pretty soon all of the Army's liaison aircraft were called Grasshoppers. It was also used by the Civil Air Patrol as a coastal patrol aircraft hunting for German U-boats off the East Coast. It was powered by a 65 horsepower engine, and its top speed was right around 90 miles an hour, and nearly 20,000 were built. Also, other aircraft of the Army Cooperation Aircraft class of the liaison or observation aircraft were the Stinson L-1, the L-2 Taylor Craft, the L-3 Aranca, the L-5 Stinson Sentinel, and the L-6 Interstate Cadet. The L-17 North American and Ryan Navion, introduced in 1948, and also the L-19, the Cessna Bird Dog, introduced in 1950, and it served a number of years even into the Vietnam War. This is the Piper Cub. The next aircraft approaching in just a couple of moments is one that first flew in 1940, and it was developed for the United States Navy. It was the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. It had a number of nicknames, one of which it received from the Japanese. It was known as Whistling Death. And as we see it approach, we will also see another unique feature of the airplane, which gave rise to another nickname, the Bent Wing Bird. The F-4U Corsair was a 430-mile-per-hour airplane powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 18-piston radial engine. And it turned a huge propeller that was over 13 feet in diameter. And it was so big that for use on the carrier deck, they had to get a landing gear that would be long enough and strong enough, but not too heavy, to prevent that propeller from striking the wooden carrier decks on those controlled crashes as they land at a rate of about 600 to 700 feet per minute downward. And the F-4U Corsair had such a large propeller that the Chance Vought designers bent the wing down, extended a short enough yet sturdy landing gear so that it would prevent the propeller from striking the carrier deck. And then they bent the wing back up. If you were around in 1976 to 1978, there was a television show which actually chronicled the use of the F-4U Corsair as it was used by the Marines in the Pacific, and it was called Ba Ba Black Sheep.
We are poor little lambs who have lost our way. Ba, ba, ba.
Robert Conrad depicted Pappy Boyington, who was the leader at 28 years old of his Black Sheep Squadron. Initially, it was to be used on the decks of carriers, but the huge engine on the front and a huge fuel tank behind that engine forced the pilot way back in the fuselage, and it was very, very difficult to maintain visibility and handling at those slow speeds to land on the deck of the carrier safely. So it was turned over to the Marine Corps for ground-based attack and air-to-air use, and it's served ably, racking up a remarkable victory record against the Japanese in the Pacific. It was the British who really led the way in the development of carrier aviation. And they took a couple of Corsairs and they made some changes to the Corsair. First, they changed the canopy to what is called a Malcolm hood, a bulged canopy, and it enabled them to raise the pilot seat up several inches. And then, taking advantage of the downward crook in the wing, they flew an oval approach to the carrier and were able then to successfully use this in the latter days of the war aboard Navy aircraft carriers. Coming in right now, the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. Not only was the Corsair built by Chance Vought Corporation, but it was also built by the Brewster Aircraft Company and another unlikely company, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Why Goodyear Tire and Rubber? Well, Goodyear made those lighter than airships, dirigibles in those days, and they knew very well how much metal needed to be used in a structure to make it strong without having dead weight. And Goodyear had been making control surfaces and parts of airplanes for some time. And so Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company set up a California production facility and turned out a great number of Corsairs. In all, some 12,571 Corsairs were built between 1940 and early 1953. It was the longest production run of a single-engine piston fighter in the history of military aviation. The Corsair also went on to serve ably during the Korean War as well. During the World War II, the most unusual kill with a Corsair was made by Lieutenant R.R. Klingman over Okinawa, who discovered his guns were jammed and proceeded to saw down a Japanese photo plane by cutting off its elevator and rudder with his prop. In World War II, the F-4U flew about 54,000 combat sorties to destroy 2,140 Japanese aircraft with a loss of only 189 Corsairs. Even though this next airplane was not armed, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower labeled it one of the 4 most important weapons of World War II, along with the Jeep, the bazooka, and the atomic bomb. It served in all theaters of the war. It was a workhorse, a troop transport, an equipment hauler, and a glider tow aircraft. And the C-47, built by Douglas, first flown in 1935, was an airplane that changed the way Americans traveled. It was designed first as a passenger aircraft, but as the war got started and progressed, production lines were commandeered by the War Department, and they were turned into C-47s. Estimates of 1,000 of these aircraft were involved in the D-Day invasion 75 years ago. And right now, of the more than 10,000 that were built, around 1,100 are still flying. 38 of them are at Normandy right now and flew this morning in their tribute of the Normandy invasion, Operation Overlord. We were very, very fortunate to be able to get this C-47, known as Whiskey 7, to come fly for us here today. The C-47 carried 15 to 17 paratroopers on it. It carried no armament. It wasn't designed to drop bombs, but the C-47 and other variants of this Douglas DC-3 twin-engine airliner quickly proved their worth both on and off the battlefield. They became a familiar sight all over the world. Eisenhower was not exaggerating with his accolade. The C-47 became crucial to the conduct of the war in at least 3 theaters and proved beneficial to military operations around the world. D-Day airdrops have become famous and are perhaps one of the World War II event most associated with the C-47s was here at Operation Overlord on Normandy. Dozens of C-47s were shot down, and hundreds were damaged by intense German fire. You can see the invasion stripes painted on it, as they were on all Allied aircraft on D-Day, so our guys wouldn't shoot down our own airplanes. One young paratrooper from the 101st Airborne Division named Ralph Manley met and shook the hand of Dwight D. Eisenhower before he boarded a C-47 bound for Normandy. And the plane in which Ralph Manley was flying was hit by enemy fire, and of the nearly 20 soldiers aboard, only 5 got out of the plane alive. Ralph Manley passed away exactly 1 month ago at the age of 95. Known as the Dakota and the Goonie Bird, the C-47 also was involved in flying the hump over China, supplying the Chinese with much-needed supplies during World War II in their fight against the Japanese, and even served at the beginning of the Berlin airlift in 1948. As Whiskey 7 departs, let me tell you about the next airplane that's approaching. In the weeks that followed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was being pounded at every turn in the Pacific by the Japanese. Morale among our fighting men and here in the States was at an incredible low, and a boost was desperately needed. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called upon military planners to devise a surprise attack on Japan. The island country had not been attacked on its own soil in over 2,000 years. And the result of that plan was to involve types of military hardware never intended to work together. The leader of the mission was Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a World War I flight instructor, and in the years following the war had become a household name in the States. He chose North American's B-25 Mitchell bomber, a twin-engine airplane that was new to the Army Air Force. Typically, it took about a half mile to get this airplane off the ground. 28,000 pounds of aluminum, engines, gas guns, bullets, bombs, and crew. Yet 16 of these were loaded aboard the USS aircraft carrier Hornet and successfully launched them in as little as 467 feet. Each carried only 4 500-pound bombs, and they dropped them on military targets in Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Yokohama. And though little damage was done, Japanese sense of invincibility was shaken, and it was not only a morale victory for the United States, but a strategic one as well. To this day, the Doolittle raid is considered to be the air mission against which all other air missions have been measured. Of the 80 men that participated in that raid, the last Doolittle raider, Colonel Richard Cole, Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot on the mission, passed away just 2 months ago at age 103. But the B-25's contribution to the war effort was not limited to the Doolittle raid. The aircraft had an important role in every theater of World War II. In the Pacific, it provided close air support, strafed Japanese tanks in airfield, and destroyed bridges. And in Europe, the Mitchell operated as a medium bomber. And the Navy and Marine Corps even used a version of it called the PBJ-1 variant to find and destroy enemy ships. It was one of the most heavily field-modified aircraft in the war. Initially with a crew of 5 and several guns on it, they took out the bombardier position in the nose and loaded 8 .50 caliber machine guns in it. 2 more on either side in blister packs, giving it a punch for strafing that was formidable. One model even put a 75 millimeter cannon in the nose. The B-25 Mitchell bomber. The B-25 was known as a medium bomber. designed to bomb at medium altitudes, carrying typically about 3,000 pounds worth of bombs. By the way, with respect to the Doolittle raid, the wrinkle in that whole mission was that they needed to steam within 400 miles of the Japanese coast, fly low and slow over the water, and then pop up to drop their bombs on those targets. But the carrier fleet was discovered some 400 miles farther out than that, making it impossible for the aircraft to have enough gas to get to their bases in China after their mission, refuel, and then fly home safely. The raiders were given the choice to scrub the mission, but they said, no, we're going to go anyway, knowing that they wouldn't have enough gas to get to where they needed to go. So they launched, flew the distance 800 miles to the coast, and flew then into worsening weather. Some of the crews ditched in the water next to the shore. Several drowned. A couple of crews were captured by the Japanese and executed as war criminals. And others flew in instrument conditions, thick clouds, until they ran out of gas at night and then bailed out. In speaking to one of the former Doolittle raiders, Tom Griffin of Cincinnati, Ohio, he said, when we bailed out, we didn't know where the ground was until we hit it. A crew of 5 or 6, but that was the medium bombers. The heavy bombers came next, and there were 3 types of those, and what we're going to see right now is Boeing's Flying Fortress. 10 crew members aboard the airplane, a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, a bombardier, a radio operator, 2 waist gunners, a tail gunner, a top turret gunner, and a ball turret gunner. They were sitting ducks to the German Luftwaffe early in the war. And it wasn't until the development of non-strategic material, kind of a papier-mâché drop tank, which would be put on the escort fighters, and a change in the formation that the B-17s flew, was their survivability increased. The aircraft approaching is one of about 11 or 12 remaining flyable B-17s in the world of over 12,700 that were built. The name of this particular B-17 is the movie Memphis Belle. It was in the 1989 movie that told the story of the first B-17 crew to complete 25 missions over Europe under the command of Colonel Robert Morgan. And this is the one that was in the movie. The original Memphis Belle was on Mud Island in Memphis, Tennessee for many years, and it deteriorated over time, and finally the United States Air Force took it back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the National Museum of the United States Air Force and restored it, and it is now on display celebrating just 13 months after its display being put on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. The bombers were known as the Big Friends. The fighters who escorted them were known as the Little Friends. The P-51 Mustang was one of those airplanes, and we'll see a Mustang a little bit later on in our presentation today. But there's an interesting story about the Big Friends and the Little Friends, and it involved a Tuskegee Airman. the first black flying squadron in the United States Army Air Force, a unit that was formed to prove that black men couldn't fly. Well, the War Department was proved wrong. They did fly, they did fight, and they did stick with the bombers and protected them against the onslaught of the German Luftwaffe fighters, the FW-190s and the Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The story involves two young men from Cincinnati, Ohio, a guy named Herb Heilbrunn and a young black kid named John Lear. They were together in a class in North Avondale in Cincinnati in the 3rd grade. And years later, it was discovered that Herb Heilbrunn was pilot of a B-17 and was escorted by John Lear in a red-tail Tuskegee Airman P-51 Mustang. Their story is chronicled in a book called Black and White Airmen. Powered by four 1,200 horsepower Wright Cyclone turbocharged radial piston engines, it could fly up at 35,600 feet, and with a 5,000-pound bomb load, could travel over 2,000 miles. Literally hundreds of B-17s would take off from the over 70 bases in England, form up over the English Channel, and then travel as a huge formation to the targets in German-held Europe. There were 4 things that the bomber crews had to worry about, known as the 4 Fs. The flak, that's the German anti-aircraft attacks. The fighters, the Bf-109s and the FW-190s. The fear of not being able to complete their mission or being shot down, and the fire that could ensue if one of their airplanes was hit. During World War II, the B-17s and the other bombers of the United States Army Air Force, including the B-24 Liberators, did daring daylight raids on Nazi-held Europe. The Royal Air Force pounded them at night with their Lancaster bombers. We will be back later with more of these aircraft and some contemporary Air Force aircraft. My name is Rob Ryder. Back to WDBJ. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please make your way to your seats, the program is going to begin in just a few moments, so we ask everyone to please begin making your way to your seats. We will note, as you are being seated, there have been a few changes to the program, including the addition of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the Honorable Robert Wilkie, will be speaking. I'd also like to give a very special thanks to our Naval Academy alumni who are out there with us today. We dedicate to the class of 1969. I hear you. Thank you all very much for all you did to make that plaque dedication happen yesterday. Thank you so much. We thank you all for being here on this glorious day with so many of our veterans. We hope you enjoy the program. We'll be starting in just a few moments. Thank you.
Would you pray with me? Eternal God, we pause at the outset of this momentous occasion to orient ourselves to you, giving you thanks for the bravery the young men of Bedford demonstrated, stepping up to the fight against evil and the defense of freedom. To have left hearth and home to venture into the rigor of military life and the imminent danger of battle speaks volumes regarding the depth of the faith and fidelity, the commitment and courage of these sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands. We lift our hearts and voices to you, 75 years later, as we commemorate the poignant loss not just of this small town, where 32 souls marched off to war and in just one day 19 were lost, but of all the nation's fallen heroes. The indelible mark left on these families is a stain hidden only by the solemn pride so many embrace, knowing that their loved one was crucial to the defense of peace. We pray that all who grieve this day would know the abiding and everlasting strength of your presence. Then may the men and women of all towns, communities, and cities throughout this country who were willing to give the ultimate sacrifice, may they be ever honored, and their memory a blessing. We pray your favor over the words spoken and the tributes offered this day. Inspire our lives with your spirit that the valor, fidelity, and sacrifice we honor would arouse each one of us to give ourselves in service to you, to each other, and to this great nation. It is in the strength of your name we pray. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors.
Can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming. In the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Please be seated. Mr. Vice President, honored guests, most importantly, veterans, I'm Senator Mark Warner, and on behalf of the Commonwealth, I'd like to welcome you all to Virginia and to Bedford. To the heroes of D-Day in attendance, it is an honor to stand in your presence and commemorate the bravery of you and your brothers who never made it home. While we honor these heroes, we should also note that Virginia is still putting forward heroes even today. Later this evening, I will head to Virginia Beach to remember the victims of the tragic shooting that took place just last Friday, but to also celebrate the enormous response and bravery of our first responders, and to remember a man named Keith Cox, who died saving the lives of a number of his co-workers. It is that spirit of sacrifice we commemorate today, as we will for years to come, so that history will never forget what happened on D-Day. It's so important that this memorial is here in Bedford, a town that sacrificed so much to this day. I'm proud to have supported this memorial as a private citizen, as a governor, and now as a senator. And I was honored to meet some of the remaining Bedford boys before they passed. Their story is remarkable, but it is also one that repeated itself throughout World War II, as ordinary men and women across America stepped forward when their country and the world needed them most. Many of their names are inscribed on the walls around us, a reminder of just how high the price of freedom can be. We retell the stories of men like Lieutenant Ray Nance, the last of the Bedford boys, because that is perhaps the closest we can come to knowing what it was like to step off his landing craft and into that carnage on that fateful June morning 75 years ago. Gentlemen, this country, this Commonwealth, are forever in your debt. And it's my pledge to you, as a senator, as the son of a Marine veteran who fought on Iwo Jima, and as an American, that the sacrifices you made will be remembered long after all of us are gone. Thank you so much. And as I look at this crowd gathered here today, I know your legacy is in good hands. This is our responsibility for those of us who've grown up free from the horrors of a whole world at war. We must pass your stories to future generations. We must uphold the principles of free nations and the values you defended. And we must do right by the veterans who have followed in your footsteps. With that, I'm pleased to introduce the man who carries that great responsibility, particularly of caring for our veterans, Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Mr. Robert Wilkie. Mr. Secretary.
That was very kind of you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Vice President, Senator Warner, distinguished guests, and warriors. Ronald Reagan said in 1984 that it is an odd thing that we do to honor those who died defending us in that war long ago. He said our imagination plays a trick. We see those who have survived as old and wise, but many of those who died were just boys. And on that day in 1944, they gave up two lives, the one on the beach and the one that they would have led had they come back. They gave up the chance to be husbands, fathers, grandfathers, teachers, pastors. They gave it all up so the rest of the world can be free. When I think of this day, I think of the words of the greatest of airborne warriors, General Matthew Ridgway, who had led the All-American Division in North Africa and Sicily and planned the airborne assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. On the evening of D-Day, he couldn't sleep. He actually fell out of his cot in distress, and he reached for the Old Testament. And he turned to the book of Joshua, to God's promise to the Hebrew people on the day of their greatest battle, when he told Joshua, "I will not fail thee nor forsake thee." In 1986, Ronald Reagan awarded General Ridgway the Medal of Freedom, and he said that heroes come when they are needed. Great men call when courage is in short supply. So this is a day about heroes and the courage that it took to keep the world free. I have the great pleasure now to introduce to you a man from a family of warriors going back to World War II in Korea with a son on the front lines in the United States Marine Corps, and his wonderful wife, Karen, who does everything that she can to remind us all that military families are the foundation of our freedom. I have the great honor and the distinct pleasure to introduce the Vice President of the United States, the Honorable Mike Pence.
Secretary Wilkie, Secretary Costa, Senator Warner, Congressman Klein, Riggleman, and Roy, our honored guests, members of the Armed Forces of the United States of America, our veterans gathered here, especially members of the greatest generation and my fellow Americans, it is my great honor to join you here today at the National D-Day Memorial, alongside men who fought on this day 75 years ago. It's humbling to be with you all, and I thank you for your presence, joining us here to remember the service and sacrifice that triumphed over tyranny and won back not just a continent, but a world to freedom. On June 6, 1944, they embarked on Operation Overlord, on what General Eisenhower called the Great Crusade. They embarked with the eyes of the world upon them. They sailed across the channel to the beaches of Normandy, carried aloft, as their general said, by the hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere. They knew the odds. They knew the enemy. They knew the enemy would fight savagely to defend that crucial stronghold. Every soldier who stepped ashore was, as Private First Class Chuck Neighbor said, a visitor to hell. But the men of D-Day pressed forward. In the chaos of battle, the bravery of men like Private First Class Hillman Prestridge and Private First Class Bill Sisk shone through. There were men like Carol Reeves and Corporal Rover Aubrey, supplying and equipping this band of brothers as they headed for the beaches. There was Second Class Petty Officer Samuel Berry, leaping from his landing craft to swim ashore, and Second Class Petty Officer Vincent Kordak, who was caring for the wounded as bullets whistled by. All of them risked all to win a great victory. And all of them, by God's grace, are here with us today. To these and other D-Day veterans among us, I say, gentlemen, you honor us with your presence. And I want to assure you, we see you not just as you are, but as you were. And seeing that, we marvel at the courage that you showed as young men. You stormed the beaches and faced the shadow of death without fear. As President Trump said today in Normandy, to those who fought on D-Day, in his words, you are among the very greatest Americans who will ever live. You are the pride of our nation, and we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Today, we also think of others from this very community who were among your ranks on that fateful day. 44 boys who had never strayed far from home, mustered out to England, and some to eternity. They were hometown folk who became national heroes. And they will forever be remembered to history as the Bedford Boys. Since the earliest days of our republic, Bedford, like every other community in this land, has given its finest to defend America in battle. But for Bedford, D-Day was different. While most of this town was still asleep in bed, First Lieutenant Ray Nance was racing across the sands, dodging mortar rounds and tracer fire. While the morning bells of the Presbyterian Church were ringing, Private First Class Dickie Overstreet was nursing his wounds along the very sea wall that he had been determined to reach. While 50 women worked late in the night at the county library, rolling 9,000 bandages for our sons and brothers overseas, Technical Sergeant Ray Stevens had already fallen after leading his men onto Omaha Beach. It was only a few days later that his twin brother Roy found Ray's dog tags on a cross in a makeshift graveyard not far from the beach they'd both landed on. That night, the people of Bedford and all of America heard President Roosevelt ask Almighty God to let our hearts be stout, to wait out the long travail, to bear sorrows that may come. And they did come. On D-Day, 20 Bedford boys with the 116th Infantry stormed Omaha Beach and fell in the defense of freedom. That such a small town would make such a sacrifice seems almost beyond belief. As the author Alex Kershaw wrote, Theirs was a story of one small American town that went to war and died on Omaha Beach. To honor their sacrifice and the sacrifice of all those brave Americans who died on that day, this National D-Day Memorial was constructed here in Bedford as a tribute to all who gave the last full measure of devotion on the longest day. It is a profound honor for me to stand with you on this day at this memorial. But I think all of you gathered here know the true memorial to the Bedford boys and all the courageous Americans who charged the beaches of France 75 years ago today is our freedom, the freedom they fought and sacrificed so much to defend. So God bless the Bedford boys and all the 9,388 Americans who lie in that quiet field overlooking the beaches they took 75 years ago today. God bless all the heroes forged on that day of days who fought and came home to the families and the land they love. And on this 75th anniversary of D-Day, on behalf of a grateful nation, to those brave veterans gathered here who fought so long ago, and to all those looking on from glory, we say one more time, thank you for your service. Thank you for our freedom. God bless you. God bless our armed forces. And God bless the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for those stirring remarks and for joining us on this special occasion. On behalf of the Board of Directors, staff, and volunteers of the National D-Day Memorial Foundation, I'm pleased to welcome each of you to the National D-Day Memorial on this 75th anniversary of the Allied landings in Normandy. Later in the ceremony, we'll specifically recognize the D-Day and World War II veterans who are here today. And we have over 100 in attendance. But what follows in the next 45 minutes you guys are going to get a lot of applause today, and rightly so. What follows in the next 45 minutes is a tribute to the history they helped to write. 18 years ago, this memorial was dedicated to commemorate the valor, fidelity, and sacrifice of those individuals involved in Operation Overlord, and also in broad recognition of the achievements of the entire World War II generation. And so, as is customary here, we will dispense with the formal introductions of the speakers who follow me. Our intent in doing so is to focus on the written or spoken words of the D-Day participants, rather than on the persons reading them here today. The stories you will hear pay tribute to all of the participating ground units, air and naval forces, Coast Guard, Marines, and merchant seamen of the Allied forces of 12 great nations. The program, either implicitly or explicitly, honors them all. Later in the ceremony, during the roll call of veterans, you will be asked to applaud. For the next 45 minutes, however, during these oral history readings, we ask you to withhold your applause as we establish the context and the flow of that momentous 6th of June as it unfolded 75 years ago today. Please sit back, listen, and reflect on what one generation who consistently tells us that they were not heroes, even though in our hearts we still firmly believe they are, what that one generation did to ensure freedom for us all.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, Allied Force, Order of the Day. Soldiers and sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade to which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hope and prayers of liberty-loving people will march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of the Nazi tyranny above the oppressed people of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. The enemy is well trained, equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened to the Nazi triumph since 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man-to-man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced the strength and the air capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion, and duty and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than victory. Good luck, and let us beseech the blessings of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking. Dwight David Eisenhower.
Lieutenant General H.D.G. Farrar, the commanding officer Commander-in-Chief, 1st Canadian Army. It's impossible for me to speak to each one of you, but by means of this personal message, I want all ranks of the Canadian Army to know what's in my mind as the hour approaches when we go forward into battle. I have complete confidence in our ability to meet the tests which lie ahead. Canadian formations in the assault landing will have a vital part to play. The plans, the preparations, the methods, and the technique which will be employed are based on knowledge and experience, bought and paid for by the 2nd Canadian Division at Dieppe. We enter into this decisive phase of the war with full confidence and full faith in our cause, with calm confidence in our abilities, and with grim determination to finish quickly and unmistakably this job we came overseas to do.
Admiral Sir Bertram H. Ramsay, Royal Navy, Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Force. We are about to embark on the most critical operation of the war, the invasion of German-occupied France, for which we have been waiting and preparing since the British Expeditionary Force was evacuated at Dunkirk. The invasion is being undertaken by an Allied force in which all arms and merchant navies will play their part. The ships that you command are amongst those selected for this vital task, and the manner in which each is conducted will have a direct bearing on the campaign ahead. The gaining of a bridgehead by the Allied Expeditionary Force requires the strongest available support from the Allied navies and air forces. The subsequent reinforcement and maintenance of the Expeditionary Force necessitates the regular arrival and quick turnaround of a vast quantity of merchant shipping of all types. Unless the volume of reinforcements and supplies can be kept up as planned, the buildup of our armies will not be able to match that of the enemy, and their position on the continent, let alone their ability to advance, may be imperiled. I know that all will be proud to be associated with this great enterprise, which is the climax of the European war. And I wish you all Godspeed.
A poem and prayer for an invading army, written by Edna St. Vincent Millay and read by Ronald Coleman in a national broadcast on D-Day. This is the hour, this the appointed time. The sound of the clock falls awful on our ears, and the sound of the bells, their metal clang and chime, tolling, tolling, for those about to die. For we know well they will not all come home to lie in summer on the beaches. Lord God of hosts, thou Lord of hosts, not alone of battling armies and king, but of the childlike heart as well, which longs to put away on, not the childish, but the adult, circuitous and adroit, antique, and violent thing called war, and sing the beauties of this late to come but oh so lovely spring. For see where our young men go forth in mighty numbers to set free from torture and from every jeopardy things that are dear to thee. Keeping thy loving care, we pray, those of our fighting men whose happy fortune it may be to come back home again after the war is over, and all those who must perforce remain, the morn, the valiant slain, this we beseech thee, Lord. O Lord, all through the night, all through the day, keep watch over our brave and dear so far away. Make us more worthy of their valor and thy love. Let them come home, Oh, let the battle, Lord, be brief, and let our boys come home. So cries the heart, sick for relief from its anxiety and seeking to forestall a greater grief.
Private First Class George Alex, 82nd Airborne Division. All this is going through your mind. What am I doing here in this airplane? Why did I volunteer? Am I crazy? You know it's getting close to daylight, and it's getting close to the time to go. Then one man gets airsick and pulls his steel helmet off to heave into it. And then everybody else down the line follows suit. Everyone is heaving, dry heaves, waiting to get out of that airplane. We're all sick and the plane stinks and we're ready to get out any time. Let's get the green light on and get out of this place. When the time came to go, out the door we went. We were happy to get out of the thing, so off we went. Yes, I was afraid. I was 19 years old, and I was afraid.
John Fitzgerald, 101st Airborne. I was mesmerized by the scene around me. Every color of the rainbow was flashing through the sky. Bundles attached to chutes that did not fully open hurled past me with helmets that had been ripped off. Some of the jumpers floated down with pendulum-like motion, while others, whose planes were flying so low, their chutes opened into trees. Off to my right, I could see a plane burning. Below me, figures were running in all directions. I thought, Christ, I'm going to land in the middle of a bunch of Germans. My chute floated into the branches of an apple tree and dumped me to the ground with a thud. I felt a strange surge of elation. I was alive. In the first hours of D-Day, a lot of small actions were fought by groups banding together to fight. The gliders were coming in rapidly, one after the other, from all directions, and many overshot the field and landed in the surrounding woods. Others crashed into nearby farmhouses and stone walls. Bodies and bundles were thrown all along the length of the field, and some of the troopers were impaled by the splintering wood of the fragile machines. We tried to aid the injured, but knew we would first have to decide who could be helped and who could not. I felt like I was becoming ill.
Jack E. Rowe, United States Coast Guard, diary entry, D-Day. Getting ready for the big show. 8th Division has just been called to chow down in 15 minutes. I've been up since 11:30, put on some heavy underwear because it is cold out. It was rough and windy. Minesweepers are sweeping the way and dropping buoys as they go. The sky is being lighted up by constant flashes about 2 points off the starboard bell. My shipmates are climbing out of the pits, some noisy as usual. Some of the noisy ones are very quiet, others talking, making speeches in a kidding way. The heavy sleepers weaving around the compartment trying to wake up. It's hard to tell who was putting on a show to cover up his feelings, but I think I spotted a couple. Most are glad the last time is here at last. It has been tiresome waiting month after month for something you know was bound to happen. Well, I have a few little odds and ends to do before I go over the side, so I guess I'll be off now to see history made and the biggest show of any war yet of its type. When I come back, I will have a lot to write about. As to coming back, there is no doubt in my mind but that I will. Jack Rowe was killed just hours after writing this message on June 6th.
Vice Admiral Lorenzo S. Sabin, United States Navy, Commander, Close Gunfire Support Group. Shortly before 6 o'clock, the eerie silence was shattered by a deafening roar. The big guns of the heavy bombardment group had opened up. We wondered how the Frenchmen in the light cruisers Georges Leg and Montcalm felt as they hurled bullets on their homeland. For the rest of us, it was an inspiring spectacle. And for this spectator, personally, it was a scene filled with emotion and pride. Among those great ships was the U.S. battleship Nevada. And as I watched her big 14-inch rifles belching forth fire and smoke, my mind went back 2.5 years to Pearl Harbor and another scene. At that time, we had watched in horror as Nevada floundered helplessly in the channel while taking a terrible mauling from the bombs of Japanese aircraft. The Japanese had good reason to believe that they had scratched her from any further combat usefulness, but here she was, halfway around the world from Pearl Harbor, with her battle ensign again proudly flying and her guns again roaring in angry answer to another challenge to freedom.
Alan W. Stevens, 8th Air Force. We saw hundreds upon hundreds of ships below, moving toward the coast of France, and when we approached the target area, we could see the naval guns shelling the coast. The Germans were not idle, however, as they threw heavy barrages at the landing craft. I saw one large ship going down, but still throwing shells at the coast. We saw hundreds of discarded parachutes that had been discarded by paratroopers who landed simultaneously with the other attacks. Those were quite a ways inland from the beachhead. I saw one B-26 Marauder explode in midair near the target area. On the beachhead, there was a tremendous wall of smoke all along the shore where the bombs and shells were exploding. The landing craft were moving up as we turned off the target area after dropping our bombs. Every move was timed to the split second. We went in at 4,500 feet on this first mission. Our bombs went away at 6:30 a.m., the precise time planned.
John Robert or Bob Slaughter, Company D, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, Omaha Beach. We loaded into our assigned stations on the landing craft and were lowered into the sea by Davis. The channel was extremely rough, and it wasn't long before we had to help the craft's pumps by bailing out water with our helmets. The cold spray blew in, and soon we were soaking wet. I could see the battleship Texas firing its 14-inch guns broadside into the coastline. In minutes, the giant swells from the recoil of those guns nearly swamped us, and it added to the sickness and misery. About 200 or 300 yards from shore, we encountered artillery fire. The craft proceeded, plowing through the choppy water as far as it could go. My thinking as we approached the beach was if this boat didn't hurry up and get us in, I would die from seasickness. As we approached the beach, the ram was lowered. Mortar and artillery shells exploded on land and in the water. Unseen snipers concealed in the cliffs were shooting down at individuals, causing screams from those being hit. The water was turning red from the blood. All around me, dead men floated in the water, along with live men who acted as if they were dead. The Germans couldn't tell which was which. All were coming in with the tide. Lying in the edge of the high water mark, I watched a GI trying to cross the beach. He had a hard time running. I believe he was from the craft to our right. An enemy gunner cut him down as he staggered and fell to the sand. I can still hear him screaming. A well-marked medical corpsman moved quickly to help him. He was also shot. I will never forget seeing that medic lying next to that dying soldier, both screaming for help. Within minutes, as I watched, both men fell silent and mercifully died.
Sergeant Cecil Breeden, medic, A Company, 116th Infantry, Omaha Beach. Every man was a hero. Never saw a coward. When I found Hal Baumgarten, he had his cheek about over his ear. I patched him up and went on my way. I glanced now and then at the boys trying to take the pillbox a machine gun crew was attacking us from. As I remember, it took 6 or more to do it. As far as I know, none of them lived. I couldn't tell you who any of them were. It was just too busy to know what was going on around me. I remember patching up Butch, the A Company mail clerk, and Lieutenant Ray Nance. Then Big Bill Presley, a master sergeant for B Company, came by, and I asked him, what was he doing? He said, looking for a rifle that will work. He pointed up the hill and said, some of my men are up there. Then he told me to get down or I was going to get hit. I said, what in the world are you talking about? You're a darn sight bigger target than me. He just grinned and went up the beach. Soon he came back with a rifle and just waved and went on.
Corporal William Dabney, 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. I was a balloon chief on D-Day. All my lower-ranking officers were black. My whole outfit was black. The only time I saw a white officer was when he came in for inspection or something like that. No one told us it was D-Day or that we were going into battle. We came into the beach on their landing barge. Artillery was heavy. As we approached the beach, my balloon caught fire. It happened just as I hit the beach, so I couldn't move. The only thing I could do then was unstrap the cables from myself and take cover under the dead so I wouldn't get shot. Others were dropping in front of me, behind me, and everywhere. I laid among the dead and ordered my men to lay down and play dead too.
Lieutenant John Spaulding, E Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, Omaha Beach. I jumped out of the boat into the water about waist deep. I was about 6:45. The men began to follow me. We were the right front line of the 1st Division. Our first casualty came at the water's edge. Private William C. Roper, rifleman, was hit in the foot by small arms fire just as he hit the beach. Just after we got ashore, one of my 2 BAR men was hit. Private First Class Virgil Tilley was hit in the right shoulder by a shell fragment, which drove a hunk of his shoulder out towards the back, but did not come all the way through. By this time, I noticed a number of my men on the beach, all standing up and moving across the sand. They were too waterlogged to run, but they went as fast as they could. It looked as if they were walking in the face of a real strong wind. On our left, we had bypassed the pillbox from which fire was coming and mowing down F Company a few hundred yards to our left. There was nothing we could do to help them. We didn't know what had become of the rest of E Company. Back in the water, boats were in flames. After a couple of looks back, we decided we wouldn't look back anymore.
Lieutenant Hugh Bone, 2nd East Yorkshire Regiment, Gold Beach. There were some horrible sights there, and not a few men calling for help. I wanted desperately to pull a body out of the waves, but he looked to be dead, and I had no time or duty there. In any case, the beach medical people would gradually get round to them all. Under the side of a tank that had been hit, I saw a bunch of my people, and I bawled at them to get up and get moving, since they were doing no good where they were, and could quite safely get along to the headquarters. I then felt a little callous when I found that nearly all of them had been hit, and that some of them were dead.
The Reverend R.M. Hickey, Chaplain, North Shore Regiment, Juneau Beach. Joel Murray from Cross Point and I landed together in the water, but we were able to touch bottom, and so we made shore. A young lad next to me fell. A bullet got him. I dragged him ashore, and there, in that awful turmoil, I knelt for a second that seemed an eternity and anointed him. The first of the long, long list I anointed in action. There was a long 50 yards of wide open beach between the water's edge and the cement wall. If you could make the wall, you were safe, for at least a while, from enemy fire, but so many of our fine young men did not make it. There on the open beach they lay, dying or dead. It was our duty to get them. The noise was deafening. You couldn't even hear our huge tanks that had already landed and were crunching their way through the sand. Some men, unable to hear the tanks, were run over and crushed to death. A blast shook the air like an earthquake. It was the engineers blowing the wall. All the while, enemy shells came screaming in faster and faster as we crawled along. We could hear bullets and shrapnel cutting into the sand around us. When a shell came screaming over you, you dug into the sand and held your breath, waited for the blast and the shower of stones and debris that followed. Then when it cleared a little, right next to you, perhaps someone you had been talking to just before lay dead. Others dying might open their eyes as you reached them. By the little disc around their necks, I knew their religion, whether Catholic or Protestant. I would tell the young man he was dying and to be sorry for his sins. And often I was rewarded by the dying man opening his eyes and nodding to me knowingly. I will never forget the courage of the stretcher bearers and the first aid men that morning.
Signalman Paul S. Fox, 7th Naval Beach Battalion, Omaha Beach. When we got within 2 or 3 miles of the beach, I saw dead bodies floating by on the water, the first encounter with death I'd ever had. We arrived at the assault area and debarked from the LST about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I climbed down a rope ladder to board an LCVP for the trip ashore. I was wearing long gloves and smelly clothing impregnated to protect against gas attack. I had rifle, canteen, backpack, and an 8-inch signal light with tripods to set it on and a gasoline-powered generator to provide electricity for it. When we got into Omaha Beach, the coxswain of the landing craft opened his ramp too soon. I can't say that I really blame him, because he was eager to unload and get away from the beach as quickly as he could. I stepped out into water up to my neck, and it didn't help that I was wearing all that heavy clothing and had things to carry. We had a good 50 to 100 yards to cover before we reached the sand. I thought I had a pretty good idea what I was supposed to do on the beach, but once I got there, it was turmoil. All I saw was smoke, fire, set by the shelling from ashore, and more dead bodies. My only job at that point was trying to stay alive.
Lieutenant Alexander Badenoch, Royal Marines, Armoured Support Group, Sword Beach. There were several craft bumping up and down on the beach with holes in their waterline. The dust and smoke made the whole thing seem unreal. The tide was running in fast, and before we knew where we were, it was round the top of our tracks. So we went on up the beach to the sand dunes at the top. My tank was the first to lead up the beach, and knowing the Germans' love for mines, these moments were very nerve-wracking. We didn't hit one though, just one of the bits of luck that one has. Out of the German dugouts in the sand dunes, a white handkerchief appeared, waving frantically. It was followed by a German who tried to give himself up to our tank. Whether he wanted a ride in it, I don't know, but I couldn't do a thing about him. So I pointed to some nearby infantry, and he went off to give up, breathing great sighs of relief.
Leonard Lamel, 2nd Ranger Battalion, 1st Sergeant, Company D. The ramp goes down. I'm the first guy shot in the company. Machine gun bullet through the right side. Then I stepped off into the water over my head and the guys pulled me out, and we just rushed to the base of that cliff and grabbed any rope we could get, and up the cliff we went as fast as we could. The wound wasn't bad. It had just gone through the muscle on my right side. Captain Bob, Company E, was the first person I ran across on top. He was shot and had his hand practically blown off, and he wasn't in good shape. We kept right on, going saying, "Captain, we'll send you back a medic." My platoon couldn't wait. We didn't stop. We played it like a football game, charging hard and low. We went into the shell craters right away for protection because there were snipers around and machine guns firing at us. And we'd wait for a moment. If the fire lifted, we were out of that crater and into the next one. We ran as fast as we could over the gun positions. There were no guns in the positions. There was an anti-aircraft position off to our right several hundred yards and a machine gun off to the left. And there was another machine gun that we got on our way in. The anti-aircraft gun was firing flat trajectory at us. And by the time we got to the road, I only had about a dozen men left. We were on top of the cliffs around 7:30.
Major John Ahern, C Company, 70th Tank Battalion, Utah Beach. I heard cries for help, and looking toward the beach, I saw three figures who I surmised were injured paratroopers. I immediately returned to the tank and got the first aid kit and tried to cross the hedgerows to get as close to them as I could. I was going through a break in the hedgerow when a personnel mine went off under me. The explosion threw me over the hedgerow, and I was unconscious for a while. Subsequently, I wakened and heard two of my crew yelling for me. It was hard to find me because I had rolled up against the embankment, but when they did, I cautioned them not to come over because of the presence of mines. They went back to the tank and got a long rope and threw the rope to me and then dragged me out from the hedgerow. My memory is a little bit fuzzy as to how I got back to the field hospital. In the early evening, in this makeshift tent, I was operated on. They would just amputate one foot because they felt I would not be able to withstand both operations. So, one foot was amputated, and I was prepared for transport back to England.
Captain George Mayberry, 4th Infantry Division, Utah Beach. Heavy mortar shells commenced exploding from the beach, as well as sporadic mortar fire from a short distance inland. A soldier just ahead of me was blown to pieces by a direct hit. The instant it happened, something small hit me in the stomach. It was a man's thumb. About then, General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. came striding along the beach. He was waving his cane and bellowing at everybody to get moving across the dunes. He kept moving as fast as possible. Some enemy riflemen began firing at me, so I picked myself up and began to run forward over the top of the dunes. Facing me were 5 of the enemy. I shot the one with his hand raised to hurl a grenade. The rest threw down their rifles and put up their hands. I handed them over to a wounded corporal and went forward again.
Private Irvin Airy, USMC, USS Arkansas, Normandy. I remember that D-Day was a long, long, long day with a lot of time up on deck for us. The 12-inch guns did do some shooting during the day, and things gradually got quieter as the soldiers ashore got a foothold and began heading inland. We figured we would get pounded once it got dark. Around dusk, a Messerschmitt flew out over the ships off the beach. It was in among the various American ships and was quickly shot down by their anti-aircraft fire. Who did it? I don't know. The Arkansas took credit for it, the Tuscaloosa took credit for it, and the Texas took credit for it. Everybody took credit for that one aircraft that was shot down. I pulled the trigger on the 20 millimeter and fired off a half dozen shots at the damn thing. I don't think I even came close to it. I was only shooting with the rest of them. Tracer bullets were flying around all over the place. Quite a spectacle there in the darkness.
President Roosevelt, D-Day, prayer, 6 June, 1944. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor. Lead them straight and true. Give them strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, and steadfastness in their faith. These men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest, they fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They yearn but for the end of the battle and for the return of the haven of home. Some will never return. Embrace these, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill's address to Parliament on the 6th of June 1944. I have also to announce to the House that during the night and the early hours of this morning, the first of the series of landings in force upon the European continent has taken place. In this case, the liberating assault fell upon the coast of France. An immense armada of upwards of 4,000 ships, together with several thousand smaller craft, crossed the Channel. The Anglo-American allies are sustained by about 11,000 first-line aircraft, which can be drawn upon as may be needed for the purposes of the battle. So far, the commanders who are engaged report that everything is proceeding according to plan. And what a plan! This vast operation is undoubtedly the most complicated and difficult that has ever taken place. It involves tides, wind, waves, visibility, both from the air and the sea standpoint, and the combined employment of land, air, and sea forces in the highest degree of intimacy and in contact with conditions which could not and cannot be fully foreseen. Complete unity prevails throughout the Allied armies, and the whole process of opening this great new front will be pursued with the utmost resolution, both by the commanders and by the United States and British governments whom they serve.
Evelyn Kowalczyk, U.S. Army Air Corps, 818th Air Evacuation Squadron, Omaha Beach. Each airplane could carry 24 litters suspended from different support beams in the aircraft. There was one nurse on each litter plane, and it was her job to keep those boys alive and as comfortable as she could make them on the 2-hour flight back to England. That was not easy. A flight nurse played a number of roles: healer, confessor, mother, cheerleader, all of them important, all of them demanding. We saw a lot, and we managed as best we could. Speaking in purely medical terms, I must say that our circumstances were primitive. That's the way it was then. We did what we had to do, and we did it with what we had available to us. My C-47 landed on Omaha Beach. Although a number of planes were shot down, that particular danger was not very worrisome at the time. Our real concern was to get the wounded boys on the planes and to a hospital. We came in low, landing on perforated steel planking that had been placed on the sand. The engines were revving as litters were pushed through the door, and we were back in the air before several of the litters were properly hung up. The boys I brought back to England were injured horribly, but not one of them on any of my flights died en route. Other nurses were not so fortunate.
Anne Frank, diary entry, 6 June 1944. This is D-Day, came the announcement over the English news, and quite rightly, this is the day. The invasion has begun. The English news at 12 o'clock in English. This is D-Day, General Eisenhower said to the French people. Stiff fighting will come now, but after this, the victory. The year 1944 is the year of complete victory. Good luck. The best part of the invasion is that I have the feeling that friends are approaching. We have been oppressed by those terrible Germans for so long. They have had their knives so at our throats that the thought of friends and delivery fills us with confidence. Now, it doesn't only concern the Jews anymore. No, it concerns Holland and all occupied Europe. Perhaps I may yet be able to go back to school in September or October.
Roy Stevens, Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. My landing craft hit an obstacle and it sank out from under us. I was in the water for 2.5 hours before someone picked us up. I had lost my rifle and gear in the water, so they sent me back to England. I returned to the beaches on June 11th. I was anxious to rejoin my men. One of the first sights I came across was a cemetery. I went to the S section of the graves. That's when I found Ray, my twin brother. There was a little white cross covered with dirt, and when I moved the dirt, I saw Ray's dog tags on it. They were still burying men there. I walked around to look for others, and I started seeing the names of other Bedford men. I didn't know how bad it was for them until I returned to the beach, walked to the high ground, and turned back to see what those guys had to land against. I don't know how any boat got in. Those boys didn't have a chance.
was good.
My grandfather once said, "It is foolish and wrong to mourn the men who died. Rather, we should thank God that such men have lived." I'm proud to stand here today at this magnificent site that serves as a visible reminder of the need each of us has in his or her heart to now say thank you to all who put themselves in peril to preserve the liberty we enjoy. With profoundest gratitude, then let us salute the valor, fidelity, the sacrifice that undergirds such service, acknowledging especially our debt to those whose hard death in battle made possible our gathering today. In a few moments, as the band plays, members of the Army Junior ROTC and volunteers will take up a collection for the National D-Day Memorial. This remarkable site has no federal or state funding and relies solely on donations. Please consider making a donation if you're so moved. It's up to each of us to keep these stories of the service and sacrifice alive so that we will never forget. And I thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Ryder, and I had the opportunity earlier today of describing to you the aircraft from World War II. Overhead right now, two of our military's newest fighters. They are the Lockheed Martin F-35A Lightning II. Similar versions are being used by the United States Marine Corps and the United States Navy. To date, just 400 of these aircraft have been delivered. They will be flown not only by the United States Air Force, Marine Corps, and Navy, but by nearly a dozen partner nations as well. Powered by 40,000-pound of thrust engines, these aircraft can fly at Mach 1.6, help our guys and ladies deliver their ordnance and get them home safely. The F-35 Lightning II. The next aircraft that will be flying over has a history that goes back to the 1950s. First flown in 1954, the C-130 Hercules is a plane that has become one of the 3 heavy lifters for the United States Air Force and many other nations as well, and many other services used by the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. The C-130 Hercules has excellent short takeoff and landing capabilities, and as we see it come by, you will see that it is an airplane, part of a family of airplanes that have set a record, because the C-130 Hercules, also built by Lockheed Martin, has been in constant production since 1954. Over 2,500 of these aircraft have been built, and the 2,500th rolled off the Lockheed Martin Marietta, Georgia production line on a very special date, December 17th of 2015, the anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, that 120 feet and 12 seconds that changed the world. As we see the C-130 approach in just a moment, I want you to take a look at a couple of things about it. The wingspan is 132 feet 6 inches. Now that's a fine statistic on its own, but what is so amazing is that the Wright brothers' first flight could have taken place totally on the wing of a C-130 Hercules. One of the most famous C-130 Hercules anywhere is that of Fat Albert, the United States Navy Blue Angels support aircraft. That airplane is being retired, and after a number of years of service, and the Blue Angels are hoping to have a new C-130J model Hercules soon to fill those big shoes of helping the team get from place to place. It's a big airplane. It carries a lot. But the C-130 Hercules also, as we see it come overhead now, look at the size of that and try to imagine it landing on an aircraft carrier. And in 1963, October of that year, a young Navy lieutenant by the name of James Flatley was given the task of deciding if a C-130 Hercules could be used as a COD, carrier onboard delivery. And Lieutenant Flatley and his crew did over 20 full stop and touch and go, non-tail hook, non-carrier arrested landings on the USS Forrestal. With only 15 feet from the edge of the right wing to the aircraft carrier superstructure, he was exceptionally talented and was able to do it. And on one of those landings during that testing phase, they got a big laugh out of it because when it landed, there was painted on the side of the aircraft a sign that said, "Look, Ma, no hook." James Flatley became the rear admiral by the time he retired and was given the Distinguished Flying Cross. From the C-130 Hercules and its 1950s birth came the biggest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, the C-5 Galaxy, weighing in at an incredible 858,000 pounds and able to carry just about anything in the world on it. But of those aircraft, there was still a need for something that could exhibit the super heavy lifting capabilities of the C-5 Galaxy and the short field takeoff and landing capabilities of the C-130 Hercules. And so the folks got to work on it and came up with an airplane which is now on its way inbound, and we will see it shortly. The C-17 Globemaster III, part of the Douglas dynasty of heavy lifters. The C-17, built by Boeing, is 174 feet long, its wingspan 192 feet, and you will notice something on the edges of the wings when it comes by, and those are winglets that help aerodynamics on the airplane. Those winglets are 9 feet high. You could just about put a hoop on it and shoot baskets. It can carry an M1 Abrams tank. And as it goes by, this is the only view we're going to get of it. It first flew in 1991 and went operational at Charleston, South Carolina, at Charleston Air Force Base, and that's where that airplane is from. A nice round of applause for the C-17. The 1950s were an amazing time. The Air Force in the late 1940s needed a new intercontinental bomber. And as legend has it, the folks at Boeing, after hearing from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base officials about what they needed for the new bomber, went to a hotel in Dayton, Ohio, got a bunch of balsa wood, and over the course of a weekend sketched out and built a small wooden model of what was to become the intercontinental bomber that totaled 744 in production. Now, only about 75 are still flying, many of which were destroyed on purpose at the billion-dollar boneyard in Tucson, Arizona, as part of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, so that with their wings cut off by guillotines out in the open, so Russian satellites could see that we had indeed reduced our force. But now there's the B-1, the nearly supersonic bomber, the B-2 stealth bomber. But from a first flight of the prototype in 1952 to the B-52A in 1954, this, ladies and gentlemen, is an airplane that may see 88 years of service life, with literally 3 generations of pilots having flown the same airplane. It's called the Big Ugly Fat Fella. It is the B-52 Super Fortress. A big round of applause for the B-52 crew from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. We show these airplanes, ladies and gentlemen, not as a show of force or just to impress you, but to let you know that the men and women who fly them exhibit the same kind of honor, courage, and commitment shown by the men and women who fought as part of our greatest generation. Thank you.
Dear veterans of World War II, ladies and gentlemen, in the cold mist of that great morning on June 6, 1944, the powerful armada of Operation Overlord brought the liberators on the soil of my country, France. Under the command of General Eisenhower, more than 70,000 Americans, together with British, Canadians, French, and other allied companions in arms, set foot on the beaches of Normandy. There, they broke through the wall of fire set off by the fierce enemy, and later joined forces with the French resistance, 500,000 men and women who had secretly assisted by denying German reinforcements. Again, our American allies had followed the path of General Pershing's army in World War I, and like the Frenchmen of Rochambeau and Lafayette at Yorktown, they had crossed an ocean. They were soldiers of free nations, up in arms against foreign oppression. By the end of D-Day, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers had perished or were wounded, including 19 from this very city, Bedford. Ladies and gentlemen, the French people will never forget what the sons of Bedford, what the sons of America, what the Allies did to restore France's freedom. Dear veterans, please allow me to say again, thank you. Your unconditional engagement changed the course of history forever. I can assure you, on behalf of the French people, that we'll never forget the sacrifice of those American soldiers who fought and died for France's destiny. Gratitude and remembrance are forever embedded in our hearts and in our minds. And to the new generation, I say, draw your inspiration from these courageous veterans who demonstrated the noblest ideals. Be proud and resolute spokespersons of these ideals, which are more than ever borne by France and the United States. God bless America. Vive la France.
It is now my privilege to read the names of the veterans who are here today, who are going to be receiving a medallion as they cross the bridge, designed for the Virginia World War I and World War II commemoration anniversaries. On one side of that gold coin is a World War II commemorative logo featuring the iconic raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, while the World War I logo on the reverse side depicts a lone World War I doughboy solemnly surveying the carnage of the war that was thought to be the war to end all wars. Who's presenting the coins? The Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, Kirk Cox, who chairs the Virginia World War I and World War II Commemoration Commission. Also, members of the General Assembly who serve on the commission, including Senator Bryce Reeves, who was a second lieutenant in the United States Army and served as an airborne ranger. Delegate Marcus Simon, former U.S. Army JAG officer, and Senator Frank Ruff, U.S. Army veteran who was born and raised here in Bedford. Also, retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Jack Mountcastle, and Stephen Combs, the Deputy Commissioner of the Virginia Department of Veteran Services and a U.S. Air Force veteran. I am going to read these names in no particular order at this point because it's just going to be a little bit challenging to keep them in order. But if you will, I will read the names and a little bit about each of the veterans who is here today to receive his coin or her coin. Roger Aubrey, Corporal, U.S. Army Air Force. He supplied and repaired P-38 Lightnings for the 34th Photo Recon Squadron. His squadron conducted critical missions ahead of D-Day to aid bomber squadrons in destroying key river crossings in Normandy. William Austin, Corporal, U.S. Marine Corps. He provided anti-aircraft defense in the Pacific and was stationed on Tinian Island defending the airstrips when the planes carrying the atomic bombs left the island for Japan. John Beam, Lieutenant, U.S. Navy. He served aboard the USS LCI-689 in the Philippines, and he also served in Korea and remained in the service until 1967. Samuel Berry, Petty Officer 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. He served as a combat medic on D-Day at Omaha Beach. After a month in France, he was sent to the Pacific, where he served in Guam, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and off the coast of Japan. John Bertrand, First Lieutenant, U.S. Army Air Force. He was a bomber pilot and a First Lieutenant in the Army Air Force. He served in Europe with the 95th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force. His 36 missions included 2 missions over the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. James Blevins, U.S. Army. He served in the Army at Camp Philip Morris in France. The camp housed American troops preparing for combat and supported repatriation of troops at the war's end. John Brown, Command Sergeant Major, U.S. Army, served with the 525th Military Intelligence Group. He served from 1944 until 1975 in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Robert Brown, Sr., Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Force. He served stateside in New York, Washington State, Utah, Montana, and Pennsylvania. He served as a drill instructor and a mail clerk, and he conducted radio code work. Joseph Brusick, Quartermaster, First Class, U.S. Navy. He served aboard the USS LSM-299 in the Asiatic Pacific Theater, where he was responsible for maintaining the ship's log and navigating. Donald Carl, Electrician's Mate, 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. Donald Carl was an electrician on the USS LSM-135 in the Pacific. He served in the Leyte landings and the landings at Luzon and Lingayen Gulf. On the 25th of May, 1945, his ship was sunk by a kamikaze attack at Okinawa. Mr. Carl survived to continue serving beyond the end of the war. Woodrow Casey Jr., Technician 5, U.S. Army. He served as a radio operator in the 238th Engineer Combat Battalion. He served in Normandy through to the Battle of the Bulge. In February of 1945, he was injured in a landmine explosion. James Chappie Chappell, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Force. James Chappell was stationed in England as a supply sergeant with the 8th Air Force during the war. He served with the occupation forces in Europe in the aftermath of the war until 1946. Harold Kerwood Clark, Private First Class, U.S. Army. He served with the 2489th Quartermaster Truck Company in Normandy, northern France, the Ardennes, Rhineland, and Central Europe. He drove trucks transporting military personnel, equipment, bombs, and other ordnance supplies. Olivia Clark, Private First Class, U.S. Army Air Force, Army, and Civil Air Patrol. Olivia was, at age 16, one of the first women to train with the Civil Air Patrol. She later enlisted in the Army Air Force during the war, serving with the 3rd Army Headquarters in Germany. She was one of only 18 women chosen to go into Germany with General Patton. Louis Cobbler, U.S. Navy. Louis served as a machine gunner aboard the USS Arkansas in both the Atlantic and the Pacific theaters. On D-Day, he was stationed off Omaha Beach with shore bombardment forces. The Arkansas later bombarded Iwo Jima and Okinawa. John Cooper, Carpenter's Mate, 3rd Class, U.S. Navy. He was a Carpenter's Mate who served with the Seabees Construction Battalion and supervised maintenance in American camps in the Asiatic Pacific Campaign. James Dorman, Radio Man 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. He served as a radio man stationed in the Pacific at Pearl Harbor, where he received encrypted Morse code messages that were sent to be decoded by the Fleet Radio Unit Pacific. Roderick Edwards, Petty Officer 3rd Class, U.S. Navy, served aboard the repair ship USS Medusa. During the war, he was stationed in the Philippines. Richard Ehlert, U.S. Navy. He served in the European and Pacific theaters and took part in the D-Day landings. And he was in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrender documents were signed. Roy Englert, Lieutenant, U.S. Navy, served aboard the USS LST-49, which carried tanks, vehicles, ammunition, supplies, and troops to shore. He took part in the invasion of Normandy, the invasion of southern France, and the invasion of Okinawa. Alfred Thomas Farrar Sr., Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. In the U.S. Army Air Force, he served stateside from 1941 to 1944 as an airplane mechanic in Walterboro, South Carolina. Louis Franciosi, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Louis Franciosi served from 1944 to 1946 with the 36th Infantry Division in France, Germany, and the Austrian Alps. Ernest Fulcher, Ship's Cook Second Class, U.S. Navy. During the attacks, he dropped depth charges, and on D-Day, his ship, the USS PC-624, was part of the flotilla at Omaha Beach, escorting landing craft to the beach. Alfred Furr, Sergeant, U.S. Army Air Force, Alaskan Air Command. Reverend Alfred Furr, a sergeant in the Army Air Force, served with the Air Force's Alaskan Air Command at Ladd Field in Fairbanks, Alaska. George Goodman, Tech 4 and Corporal, U.S. Army. George Goodman served with the 567th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion and fought in northern France, Central Europe, the Ardennes, and Rhineland campaigns, destroying German aircraft and protecting railheads, bridges, and airstrips. William Fred Goodrich, Technical Sergeant, U.S. Army. He was a tech sergeant in the 76th Infantry Division, served in the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhineland Offensive, crossing the Saar River into Germany. Floyd Gross, Tech 5, U.S. Army, operated light Army trucks to haul guns, personnel, rations, and ammunition to the front lines, driving at night under blackout and combat conditions. He participated in 5 campaigns in Italy, France, Germany, including the Normandy campaign. Lawrence Gulick, Major, U.S. Army Air Force. He was a B-24 bombardier with the 466th Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force. He served in Europe and flew in the Normandy invasion and in northern France. Henry Gurney, Private First Class, U.S. Army. He landed on Omaha Beach with the 2nd Infantry Division, then fought in France. After recovering from wounds, he went back into combat with the 104th Infantry Division in Germany. William Gwathmey, Major, U.S. Army. He served in Europe with Headquarters Company, 1st Army. He participated in the Normandy campaign and the Battle of the Bulge. Harlan Line Harner, Technician 5, U.S. Army. He landed on D-Day supporting the British 50th Division. His unit took part in the breakthrough at St. Lo, the liberation of Paris, and the battles of the Hurtgen Forest and the Ardennes, fighting through to VE Day. James Hardigan, Seaman First Class, U.S. Navy. He served on the USS Lovering and the USS LST-747. He fought at Tarawa, Eniwetok, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Clarence Hawkins, Chief Engineer, Merchant Marines. He served as a Chief Engineer in the Merchant Marines, delivering cargo and munitions on transport ships. He delivered supplies to locations in France, the Marshall Islands, and Okinawa. He later served in Korea and Vietnam. Theodore Heyman, Petty Officer, 3rd Class, U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps. Theodore Heyman served in the South Pacific with Company B of the 2nd Marine Division's 2nd Tank Battalion. He participated in the landings at Tinian, Saipan, and Tarawa. John Hefty, U.S. Navy. John Hefty joined the Navy in 1945 and served in Norfolk, decommissioning ships from the war in Europe, which had just ended. The ships were being prepared for deployment into the Pacific, where the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Japan. William Eisenman, Corporal, U.S. Army. He served with the 252nd Combat Engineer Battalion and landed on the beach at Normandy on September 22, 1944. He earned 3 battle stars for campaigns in North Africa and Europe, including the Rhineland campaign. Thomas Jeffords, U.S. Navy, National Guard, and U.S. Air Force. He joined the service in 1945 and served in the Navy, the National Guard, and the Air Force until 1979. Bobby Johnson, Colonel, U.S. Army Air Force, National Guard. He served in the Pacific Theater, and he also served in the Virginia National Guard and in the Virginia Defense Force. Mr. Johnson became a volunteer for the National D-Day Memorial when it opened in 2001 and remains a dedicated volunteer and generous benefactor. John Jones, Sergeant, U.S. Army. He served in the 4th Infantry Division, landed on Utah Beach on D-Day and was wounded. He recovered and fought again with his unit in the Hurtgen Forest, where he lost his right leg when he was wounded by shrapnel. Curtis Kennedy, electronics technician, 3rd class, U.S. Navy. Curtis served as an electronics technician in the Navy. After completing his training, he was stationed at a communications center in the Philippines. Albert Kershaw, motor machinist, 2nd class, U.S. Navy. He served on the USS Thomas Jefferson and operated landing craft to support the landings in Sicily in July of 1943 and Normandy on D-Day. Vincent Kordak, pharmacist's mate 2nd class, mate 2nd class, U.S. Navy. Vincent Kordak served as a medical corpsman with the 6th Naval Beach Battalion and landed on Omaha Beach with the 2nd Wave on D-Day, where he treated casualties. He later participated in the invasion of Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. Robert Lanier, Corporal, U.S. Army. He served with the 103rd Division in Europe from 1944 to 1946 and received battle stars for 2 European campaigns. Robert Listu, Colonel, United States Army Air Force. He served as a C-47 pilot and an instructor. Immediately following the war, he served in China supporting General Marshall's Beijing headquarters group. A career pilot and Air Force officer, he served until 1969. James Lynch Sr., Tech 4, U.S. Army. Served with the 125th Mechanized Cavalry Recon Squadron. He landed in Normandy on D-Day +9 and served in France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. Leroy Malzy, U.S. Navy. He served in the Navy aboard the USS Midway. He served in the North Atlantic. Evelyn Marshall, Seaman First Class Radioman Striker, U.S. Navy Waves. Evelyn Marshall entered the U.S. Navy Waves on her 20th birthday. She attended boot camp at Hunter College in the Bronx and radio school at Miami University in Ohio, and she worked out of the U.S. Navy building in Washington, D.C. as a radio operator. John McCain, U.S. Army. He served in the Army as a lineman in the European theater. George McConn, Master Chief, U.S. Navy. Served aboard a convoy escort vessel in the Atlantic. During and after the Normandy invasion, his ship patrolled the English Channel Islands, preventing supplies from reaching German occupation forces on those islands. Hubert McConnell, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. He was in Company K of the 116th Infantry Regiment, was among the first troops to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He went on to fight at St. Lo and Brest, where he was wounded, and continued to fight after his recovery. Henry McBride, Seaman First Class, U.S. Navy. He served with the U.S. Atlantic Fleet and was stationed at Fort Pierce and Fort Myers. He was preparing for an invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs were dropped. John McVoy, Private First Class, U.S. Army. He served with the 99th Infantry Division. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and his division was first to cross the Rhine after capturing the bridge at Remagen. D. Paul McGraw, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. He landed on Utah Beach on July 4th, 1944, and served in the Normandy, Northern France, Rhineland, and Central European campaigns. He fought in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge. Eugene Mayong, Lieutenant Junior Grade, U.S. Navy. He was a frogman and a platoon officer in the Navy's underwater demolition team. He served in the Pacific at Okinawa and trained for a possible invasion of Japan. Charles H. Neighbor, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Charles Neighbor served with the 116th Infantry Regiment on the 29th Division and was a member of the first wave on Omaha Beach on D-Day. He was injured at St. Lo and again at the Roar River crossing, but recovered both times to rejoin his company. Joseph Nelson, Private First Class, U.S. Marine Corps. Dr. Joseph Nelson served stateside in the Marine Corps from 1942 to 1946 and trained at Parris Island, Camp Lejeune, and Joint Base Charleston. Marion Noel, Motor Machinist's Mate 3rd Class, U.S. Navy. Served aboard USS LST 778, the first LST to land at Iwo Jima, which furnished the flag raised on Mount Suribachi. Mr. Noel also took part in the Battle of Okinawa. Alan Orendorff, Technical Sergeant, U.S. Army. He parachuted into Normandy on D-Day with the 101st Airborne Division. As he fought in France, he was wounded trying to destroy German munitions sites. He was later sent to the Pacific. Hugh Papworth, Lieutenant, U.S. Army Air Force. Served as a bomber pilot on a B-24 with the 5th Bomb Group in the European and Pacific theaters. He flew 57 missions during the war. William Parsons, Lieutenant Junior Grade, U.S. Navy. He served with the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Pacific. Assigned to tank landing craft, he took part in the liberation of the Philippines. Orland Phillips, Sergeant, U.S. Army. Served with the 113th Ordnance Company, served in the Pacific, including at Guadalcanal and the South Pacific Islands. Hammett Lee Piercy, Corporal, U.S. Army. Served with the 157th Engineer Combat Battalion, took part in the D-Day invasion and fought in campaigns across France. During the Battle of the Bulge, he was captured by the Germans and spent 4 months as a prisoner of war. Thomas Guy Powers, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army. Thomas Guy Powers served with the 29th Division in France and Belgium, Holland, and Germany. 5 of his brothers also served in the war. Mr. Powers later served in Korea. Hillman Prestridge, Private First Class, U.S. Army. Fought with the amphibious force attached to the 1st Army and came ashore at Omaha Beach. He fought at Normandy and St. Lo. Lynn Rachel, Corporal, U.S. Army, served in the 99th Infantry Division, served at Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, Siegfried Line, Ruhr Pocket, and Remagen. James Ralston, Tech 4, U.S. Army. He served in the 95th Medical Gas Treatment Battalion of the 3rd Army. He took part in the Normandy campaign, and his battalion earned a meritorious unit citation for service at the Battle of the Bulge. Raymond Harrison Riggs, Tech 5, U.S. Army, served with the 542nd Ordnance Company and landed in Normandy after the Allied forces secured the beach. His company stayed close to the front lines as they continued into France and Germany. Russ Robinson, Captain, U.S. Army Air Force. He served with the 8th Air Force as a pilot of a B-24 Liberator bomber and piloted 34 bombing missions, including 3 to Berlin, 5 to Magdeburg, Germany, and a final mission over Salzburg, Austria. Ash Rothline, Tech 4, U.S. Army, served with the 187th Advanced Army Ordnance Depot Company of the 1st Army. His unit made its way across Normandy shortly after D-Day and continued into northern France and Germany. In Bedford, Mr. Rothline spearheaded the effort to install the homage sculpture here at the National D-Day Memorial. Donald Seaman, Sergeant, U.S. Army, an M1 sharpshooter with the Mechanized Cavalry 2nd Division, trained in M5 and M5A1 tanks, and served in armored cavalry in the China-Burma-India campaign. In New Delhi, he served as a personal driver to General Terry. Carlos Showalter, Sergeant, U.S. Marines. He served with Company C of the 23rd Marine Regiment of the 4th Marine Division. He served at the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima. Mr. Showalter was one of the few in his company to return home after the war. Ralph Sigmund, Petty Officer, 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. He was scheduled to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, but the crew were ordered to abandon ship after their tank landing craft lost both engines. Of the 27 men aboard, 9 were lost in rough waters. Mr. Sigmund survived to continue serving in Europe, the South Pacific, Japan, and later in the Korean War. Bill Sisk, Private 1st Class, U.S. Army. Went ashore on D-Day on Utah Beach with the 90th Infantry Division. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge and took part in the liberation of Flossenburg concentration camp and the recovery of Nazi gold and stolen artwork at Merker Salt Mine. Marshall Smith, Tech Sergeant, U.S. Army. Served as a forward scout in Company B of the 114th Infantry Regiment of the 144th Infantry Division. He served in France, Germany, and Austria. Anthony Toledo, Sergeant 1st Class, U.S. Army. He landed with the 405th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Gun Battalion at Omaha Beach in July of 1944. He went on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge and continued into Germany. Dan Villarreal, Sergeant, U.S. Marine Corps, served with the occupation forces in Europe and in the aftermath of the war. He later served in the Middle East in the 1948 Israeli War and stateside at Camp Lejeune during the Korean War. John Waller, Private 1st Class, U.S. Army, served in Northern Europe with Company B of the 264th Infantry. He survived the sinking of the SS Leopoldville on December 24, 1944, after the ship was struck by a torpedo from a German submarine en route to France for the Battle of the Bulge. John Ward, Corporal, U.S. Army, served with Company A of the 2nd Chemical Mortar Battalion. The battalion took part in Operation Husky and 2 other amphibious assaults, as well as an airborne landing in southern France. James M. Warren III, Tech 5, U.S. Army. Served with the Army Signal Corps in the Asiatic Pacific Campaign and took part in the liberation of the Philippines. He served from 1943 to 1946. Clarence Wenzel, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy. He enlisted in the Navy in 1943 and trained to become a naval aviator, following in the footsteps of his older sister and brother, who were also aviators. Following the war, he traveled around the world aboard the USS Tarawa. Lester Willis, Private 1st Class, U.S. Army Air Force. Served stateside, undergoing aviation cadet pilot training in Illinois, Mississippi, and Texas. William Woodall, Gunner's Mate 2nd Class, U.S. Navy. He served from October 1942 through November of 1945. Burl Wright, Private 1st Class, U.S. Army. Served in Italy and North Africa. He was preparing for an assignment in the Alps when the war in Europe ended. And Chester Ross, U.S. Army Air Force. Chester Ross served stateside as a multi-engine bomber mechanic at Hunter Army Airfield, working primarily on B-25s. He was later reassigned to Aberdeen, Maryland, to train as an intelligence officer. There were more people who were unable to be here today. Those names will be recorded, but we do have some additional aircraft that are going to be coming in just a moment. But would you join me in one final round of applause for the men and women of the greatest generation? In 1997, in a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the United States Air Force, a group of former military and civilian pilots flying World War II and Korean and Vietnam era vintage warbirds, trained and teamed up with pilots flying current U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft. From that event was born this, the United States Air Force Heritage Flight. Could I ask for my blue iPad, please? Blue iPad. The blue iPad back there, please. Leading the, ladies and gentlemen, in the World War II P-51 Mustang is Lynchburg University alumnus Andrew McKenna. Also in formation, flying the F-22, Major Paul Lopez. In the F-16 Fighting Falcon, Major Garrett Schmitz. And in the F-35, Captain Andrew Olson. As these aircraft reposition, we are going to do something very special. We are going to have a missing man formation, usually flown for a fallen aviator, but flown today in honor of all those who gave their lives at Normandy, and especially the Bedford boys. We will see one airplane, the P-51 Mustang, pull out of the formation, indicating that that aviator and those who have perished have gone on to heaven, headed west, as they say, in aviation circles. And during that time, we will have the playing of taps. Ladies and gentlemen, as they reposition, I'm going to ask, please, that we remain silent. Those who have to move about, please do so. But shortly, we will have the playing of taps and the missing man formation. Not yet. I'll give you a cue. Thank you. Glad you're here. What's your first name? Brian Campbell. Rank? Thank you. Sergeant Brian Campbell will be the bugler playing taps in just a moment. Be a quick cue, okay? Thanks, man. I think it's going to be about 20 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, the playing of taps. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You may be seated. And thank you, Sergeant Brian Campbell, for the playing of taps.
Receive the benediction. Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. As the bell tolls for the sons of Bedford, for the 4,413 who died on that fateful Tuesday, and for the souls of all who were lost to the ravages of war, cause the sound of freedom to ring louder and truer because of their sacrifice. May this clarion call awaken in us and inflame in the hearts of all Americans and her allies the same certainty of purpose, the same passion for peace, the same values and virtue that we would trust in your call to arm ourselves for the war we still fight against an enemy who is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. Cause our tribute to these heroic sons to be both a reminder and an awareness that you have called each of us to step out in faith to live our lives, even to death, ever committed to freedom and liberty. We pray for your wisdom for our leaders, for your will for our nation, and for your peace over this world. It is in the strength of your name we pray. Amen.
And that concludes today's program, A Final Salute. Some of the things that really stood out to me, just seeing these World War II veterans and all veterans who made it out today, maybe having trouble walking, older now of course, but still here, wearing their hats proudly, showing where they served, when they served. And Robin, the flyovers, just so touching.
It was, Gene, as we saw the various aircraft through the day, just a stark reminder of what war brings to people. And then the missing man formation at the very end where the aircraft peeled off. And there were several generations of aircraft coming over, signifying, I think, that, there's a lot of people and a lot of time has passed, 75 years since this invasion.
Very moving ceremony, and so many people came out today to Bedford, Virginia, of course, the town that had the most loss of life on any single day. And Vice President Mike Pence put it perfectly. Thank you. Thank you for our freedom.
Exactly. And we thank you for being with us today with our coverage and for all the folks here in Bedford, Virginia. Good day.
Good day.